Good afternoon and welcome back. Well, it is sometimes difficult to focus on serious issues and elements after lunch. However, I promise you that this panel will go very smoothly and that it will catch all of your attention given the expertise and the profile and the knowledge of the panelists, Dr. St Pierre, Hisham Hashimi, and Peter Romaniuk, whom I will have the chance to introduce in a couple of minutes. Well, thus far in the morning, the two panels have focused on counterterrorism and de-radicalization as two separate sets of policies. By contrast, this panel is meant to look at counterterrorism and de-radicalization as intertwined policies and programs. So the main objective is really to look at the nexus between counterterrorism and de-radicalization, but also the nexus between counterterrorism and maybe the prevention of violent extremism programs, or what we call today in the common language with the acronym PVE. It's very important, of course, to consider the interlinkages between counterterrorism and de-radicalization because as the experience of the United States shows in Syria and Iraq, but also as the experience of most of European countries shows, it is impossible for any country and for any state today to formulate an effective policy to counter terrorism without developing a comprehensive framework of analysis of the phenomenon of terrorism and without elaborating comprehensive policies and strategies that are meant not only to tackle terrorism, so the phenomenon when it occurs, but that are also meant to tackle the phenomenon before it even occurs. So this panel will address a series of questions. First of all, to what extent are counterterrorism and de-radicalization strategies intertwined and linked in the policy framework of major international actors? And we will take the example of the US, the EU, and Russia. Second, who are the agencies and the institutions who are today in charge of implementing counterterrorism and de-radicalization programs in these countries? And what are the relations that bind them together? Can we speak of an efficient and an effective cooperation and coordination among these different institutions? Or can we sometimes identify some overlaps in their duties that might cause some dysfunctionalities or that might limit the effectiveness of the response brought to terrorism? Third, and maybe most importantly in my opinion, how can we explain that some countries and states who have been implementing de-radicalization and counterterrorism programs at least since the 1990s have failed to predict, let alone to prevent, some of the bloodiest attacks on their soil? I'm thinking, for example, of France with the bloody attack of the Bataclan in November 2015, or even the Charlie Hebdo attack in January of the same year. These attacks actually happened at the moment when the French government was taking pride in implementing what it called successful de-radicalization programs. So what happened? What is the problem with these programs? And what are the main challenges that states face in successfully implementing such programs? And finally, what are today the combinations of de-radicalization and counterterrorism strategies that have proved to be successful? Said differently, can we today identify some best practices and some successful stories or some success stories in the implementation of such programs, some success stories that can be replicated and can be used as a model? So to answer all these questions and many more, we have a highly interesting panel, and I will introduce the first panelist, Dr. St Pierre. St Pierre has contributed research and analysis on political extremism and terrorism for over 20 years. He also works extensively in the field of counterterrorism and security initiatives, notably in Africa, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, so everywhere. He's today the CEO and counterterrorism advisor for the Modern Security Consulting Group, MOSECON, where he directly advises heads of state, governments, and policymakers on how to develop counterterrorism and security strategies. His analysis is sought by international media, and he's a regular contributor to the BBC, RFI, France 24, CBC, and AFP, among others. And today he will speak about this nexus between radicalization and terrorism in the policy framework of the US, the EU, and Russia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jana. I'm actually out of breath for you with that introduction, and also I'm feeling the pressure of your promise, so I'll try to deliver on that said promise. And also, I had originally a presentation with slides, but with the content that was presented this morning, I decided to adapt it because what I have to say involves a lot of what was said this morning, and you'll definitely recognize a lot of elements. It's also a very unforgiving and very daunting task to try to talk about prevention within counterterrorism terrorism strategies in 3 areas of the world that are very busy and very big. So it'll be more of an overview. I'll try to go in certain aspects into detail, but you'll have to forgive me if I try to summarize pretty much everything in 12 minutes. But definitely afterwards with questions, I can try to help out. Also of importance is I know that despite Boris and the Brexiteers' efforts to withdraw from the European Union, that the UK is still part of the EU for the next 7 weeks or so. But from a counterterrorism and security strategy standpoint, the UK is always much closer to US policy than it is to EU policy. So I'll be referring to US-UK, the EU and Russia, rather than include the UK into the EU as part of its program, so that the understanding and some of the differences are actually better understood. I'll also focus on the common denominators. I'll try to explain some particular elements for each region, but as a whole, I think it's important to talk about the common denominators because those we can actually use to build something upon and adapt it to every context, as was mentioned earlier today. I'll talk about counterterrorism first, even if we take it for granted. We seldom really understand what is meant by that. And the reason why I want to mention it is that the first reflex when I talk about counterterrorism to people is that they think hard security right away. It's all about police, the military, technology, special forces, operations. It's about the hard security. That's the first interpretation decision makers as a whole will have. The other one is that it's about government. Counterterrorism is state government based, whether it's a national government or a local government. It's a matter for states and governments. The other is that it's all about the short term. It's about action and reaction. Something happens, I react to it. Somebody adapts, I react to it again. And that short-term aspect, as I'll show later, is probably one of the biggest issues in terms of integrating prevention policies into a broader counterterrorism strategy. And finally, especially in all three of those areas, but also it applies to Africa as well and to parts of Asia, is that terrorism is perceived as an external factor. It's seen that elements come from outside. Somebody online is radicalizing my population. It's always seen as an external factor. And so if the approach is to try to mitigate, try to counter that external element, then I'll be okay. Where that leads us in terms of particulars, if we look at the US and the UK, their approach for the last, I would say 20 plus years is a lot more tech oriented. It's material oriented. So if I have better online tools, if I have better technology, if I have, it's all about the toys, as I call it. No, they're not toys, but they're still, it's about the toys. And that is a huge contrast compared to the EU or Russia. There's also, in the Anglo-Saxon world, there's it's almost exaggerated, but it's so much that there's a lot of subcontracting. It's all about, can I save money by subcontracting to actors who can also take the responsibility for it. If I, as a state, I will delegate specific tasks, and so that is very prominent in the UK and the US, and also it's very decentralized. All the more in the US because there you have jurisdiction issues, state, federal level, county level. So you have all these. The idea is okay, no, just do it locally. Take your own initiatives. We'll see if it eventually works out in a broader framework, but the coordination is less centralized. In the EU. There's less subcontracting. The reason for that is both nationally and at the EU level is that the governments and the EU will, or as an organization, will try to integrate civilian organizations into the governmental structure. So it's there'll be a broader coordination. Does that fit into my policy? Does that fit into my national policy? And so the subcontracting is there, not as much as in the UK or in the US, but it's more coordinated. It's more, there's an oversight, and that is a very important difference. And as we saw earlier from Bibi van Ginkel's slide, there's a lot of policy levels, and that's I describe it as a catastrophe. But it's overarching, it's overlapping, it's very often competitive, and that creates that's very peculiar to the EU side of counterterrorism. In Russia, it's quite the contrary. It's very centralized. It's all dictated out of Moscow. There are very little or civilian initiatives, and when there are, it's because they have central support or central framework. There are some religious organizations involved, especially in the Caucasus. I'll get to that later as well. But usually the guidelines and the oversight is much stronger because it's all about security is a matter of the state. It needs to be centralized and coordinated. Let's turn to the prevention aspect now. And what are the common denominators when we're talking about prevention or PCV in general is that in any of those countries or those areas, it's a civilian issue because the expertise isn't necessarily there. So they'll rely on NGOs for the most part who are seen, Friedrich mentioned earlier the Birkenstock hippies, or the other term could be the tree huggers. It's seen as soft security. It's seen as, well, you're not really tough, but we'll accept it, and it's cute. No, apologies for if the words, the expression may be insulting, but I don't mean it that way. I'm just relaying the impression. What is positive about that is that it's non-reactive. So it's all about the long term, which is also an issue. If my framework is short term and I bring long term ideas, you can imagine what the clash is. So it's very proactive. Perhaps the biggest issue, but that's in every area, is that it's interpreted as the magical solution. If I do my prevention work really well, won't have any terrorism. If I invest enough money, I won't have any terrorism. That's wrong, of course. It's all about combining resources, but too often by decision makers, it's interpreted as such. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges by civilian organizations to try to explain, I need some time, it's not a magic solution. I compare it very often to addiction. You cannot say, even if you've been sober for 30 or 40 years, you are still an alcoholic. You are still a drug addict. And with extremism, if we're talking about prevention and de-radicalization, we have to see in that aspect. And probably one of the greatest vulnerabilities in all of these areas is that prevention is very much, or actually fully dependent on external funding. I know a lot of organizations that plan their budget only for 6 months or a year because each year they have to renew the demand either to a state organization or they're very dependent on the donors. And so that is a very different approach and outlook than if you know your military budget is sealed for the next 2 years and that you have backers with deep pockets. If you are very stressed out and focusing on filling out forms to get funding, that affects the work you do as well. So but that's in every area, like I said, UK, US, EU, and for the very few, very rare Russian organizations. when we talk about the particulars about PCVE, I'll put it down to two categories: the diffuse versus eliminating approach. And I'll let you try to guess. I'm pretty sure you know which way I'm going with this, who's eliminating and who's diffusing. So the US and the UK, as we mentioned before coming on air, before the panel started, is that the US and the UK focuses a lot on early warning systems. So if you're in a position within your community, because your teachers, your community leaders have been trained to recognize the early signals of potential radicalization or extremism, then you're doing a good job, then we can already work on these people. That is highly debatable. Of course, we know how all the arguments surrounding the PREVENT program in the UK and a lot of the mistakes. But the early warning system in the UK and the US is very strong. Also, the idea of counter narratives, and what I mean by especially online. The EU is focused a lot on counter narratives, but it's been, as we've seen earlier, it's been on a more personal level. How can I diffuse? How can I change through more of a personal contact? How can I teach my personnel to have a proper exchange? Whereas the US and the UK will say, hey, if I can get a YouTube video to do the work for me, if I can work with Google to do the work for me. It's about the toys, and that affects how they view prevention. With the US and the UK, that's probably an envy from the EU side, is that businesses are very involved. You look at what Google's done, Facebook, of course, a lot of the Silicon Valley companies, but there's an involvement of the private sector within the security sphere, and that's been for ages. That is actually a staple of American security culture, but you see it applied now to prevention because, call me cynical if you want to, but a lot of these companies see prevention programs as a testing ground as well for some of their software. So positive outcome, but maybe for more personal motive. For the EU, that's personally my favorite. I like the personalized approach. Friedrich and the previous panel and everybody talked about it already. It's one-on-one, it's more demanding, it's more human-oriented, and it's definitely more flexible. You can adjust to the discourse. You don't work with, here's my blueprint, I'll apply it to this, you can adapt. And that is very peculiar and very particular for the EU and very nice. Unfortunately, there's a horrendous degree of competition, my German just coming out, between all of these prevention organizations for funding, for best practice at every level. And that's really sad. That's another topic. I'll talk about it at the end. But because it's an EU-approved program, then it's seen as better. But the others say, no, my approach is actually better and better adapted. And you have that at every possible level: communal level, state level, country. It's really, really bad, and it does affect the way prevention work is perceived, because there's simply no, let's say, complementary work that allows people to actually establish common standards. And as I mentioned earlier, the overlapping of initiatives, that is a very EU-oriented issue that affects the way they view and integrate prevention policies in broader CT policies. Getting to Russia now, earlier we heard preventing versus preventing. In the Russian case, it's probably more preventing versus preempting. And so if somebody is considered that there'll be a problem in the short or midterm, they'll deal with the problem. Now, whether we agree or not about human rights, and it's their approach, and they're very, very aggressive about it. And they, as we heard this morning, they apply it to opponents, to potential terrorists, to extremists. That approach is very aggressive. And it's about demonstrating power. It's about a show of strength. And if people feel intimidated, then the idea of possibly joining an extremist group, then there's a degree of mitigation there. So it's very classic, but it's about power. When these people are arrested, then we're not talking about a nice one-on-one discussion. They get citizenship courses, to put it lightly. It's about renewing the identity towards the state, towards the community. And that is very peculiar. Of course, it applies to other states as well with the money like Saudi Arabia and China. But that in the context that we're speaking of today, it's very typical for Russia. And Russia, of course, focuses its prevention work very much on the Caucasus. It's not necessarily a national program, but they see the Caucasus as being the problem, and they'll focus there. Quickly, the common issues related to integrating prevention policies and strategies into a broader counterterrorism strategy is the absence of common standards. So who's right? Who's wrong? Who actually has success? And that doesn't work because prevention cannot be quantified. Sorry. How do you quantify somebody that's pulled out of an organization? You can say, I have one person, but if 20 years down the line that person joins another organization, it's a failure, but you can't measure that. So the lack of being able to quantify the success is a major problem, especially for deciders, because it's all about the numbers. Is this effective? Will this be effective in 6 months, in 12 months? Okay, good, fantastic. Whereas actually we all know that prevention is all about, it's a leap of faith, especially for decision makers, because you can't back it up or with great difficulty with numbers. That brings, of course, misguided expectations. If I think, I take the example of France, who's, that was one of the biggest problems, is that they presented de-radicalization as the main solution, and it didn't really work out, or people were expected to deliver something tangible within 12 months, which is absurd. But the expectations were there because, again, the general framework, especially from a political standpoint, is based on the short term, so the long term does not work. The strong competition, and in general, I would say the poor integration of prevention strategies into the general counterterrorism strategies because of the understanding, the framework. Right now, it's still incompatible. There's a change. There's a progressive one after 2014, 2015, but still very entrenched. In concluding, only probably a more common understanding of counterterrorism. Actually, our understanding of counterterrorism is what defines how prevention is integrated. If we see counterterrorism as something we need to crush, then prevention doesn't mean much. If we see it as a long-term problem that we need to understand and use the methods for it, then prevention can be very useful. As I said, regardless of the issues of human rights or repression and political issues, there's still no best approach. Right now, nobody can claim to say, my method is better. And that is also a major problem, because that, as we know when we speak to decision makers, is one of the worst questions is, has it been done elsewhere? Or what are references? Again, we're talking about leap of faith. And finally, I think if we're going to properly integrate preventive strategies into a proper CT strategy, then we need to understand that this counterterrorism strategies need to be multifaceted, they need to be flexible, they need to feed off each other and not in spite of each other. And once we understand that all the resources need to complement each other, I think we'll have a much more adaptable and comprehensive strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, for this insightful and comprehensive analysis, which nevertheless paints a gloomy picture, relatively a gloomy picture, because you highlighted many times in your presentation that it's almost impossible to find today best practices and success stories, precisely because it is very difficult to quantify how we prevented actually radicalism and extremism. I have many questions for you, but I will leave them till the end in order to save time, and I will turn immediately to the second speaker, and I will shift to Arabic. إذا المتحدث الثاني هو الدكتور هشام الهاشمي، وهو مؤرخ وباحث في الشؤون الأمنية والاستراتيجية والجماعات المتطرفة. I'll give time for the translation. إذن الدكتور هشام الهاشمي مؤرخ وباحث في الشؤون الأمنية والاستراتيجية ومختص بملف تنظيم داعش وأنصارها، هو باحث مساعد في مركز كارنيجي وباحث زائر في مركز النهرين للدراسات الاستراتيجية، كما أنه يشغل عدد من الأدوار والمناصب في عدد من الهيئات الحكومية وغير الحكومية في العراق. أذكر مثلا أنه عضو فريق مستشارين لجنة تنفيذ ومتابعة المصالحة الوطنية في مكتب رئيس الوزراء في العراق، كما أنه مستشار أمني لمرصد الحريات الصحفية والمركز العراقي لحقوق الإنسان. له عدد من المنشورات، أذكر من بينها عالم داعش، نبذة عن تاريخ القاعدة في العراق وتنظيم داعش من الداخل. واليوم سوف يتطرق في ورقته إلى نجاحات وإخفاقات سياسات مكافحة الإرهاب ومكافحة التطرف العنيف، انطلاقا طبعا من دراسة حالة سوريا والعراق. الكلمة لك.
شكرا جزيلا. أنا راح أنطلق من ما بدأ به دكتوريان. هناك دمج رديء لآليات الوقاية من التطرف بوسائل مكافحة الإرهاب، هذا ما نعاني منه. لا تزال هناك عمليات الدمج ليست مؤهلة أن تنتج بيئة طاردة للإرهاب. اليوم صباحا كثير من الورقة التي أتكلم فيها تم الخوض فيها وأيضا أعطوا الكثير من حقها. سوف أتكلم عن برهان ما تكلم عليه دكتور يان، وبرهن ذلك في تجربة في العراق بعدما هزمنا داعش كموارد بشرية في جغرافيا احتلها في العراق، واستطعنا إلى حد ما تجفيف منابع تمويل الإرهاب بمساعدة التحالف الدولي ومنع تدفق المهاجرين إلى أرض العراق. وأيضا مع التحالف الدولي استطعنا أن نضعف غواية تنظيم داعش ووسائله الإعلامية. أربع استراتيجيات ممكن أن نقول عمل عليها العراق منذ عام 2014 إلى عام 2017: القضاء على الموارد البشرية وتجفيف التمويل ومنع تدفق المهاجرين، وأيضا إضعاف غواية التنظيم الإعلامية. استطعنا في عام 2017 في نوفمبر 2017 إعلان النصر العسكري، وكان من المفترض أن تكون المرحلة التالية هي مرحلة المعالجات، لأنه افترضنا أنه في الأعمال العسكرية سوف نطرد الموارد البشرية لهذا التنظيم، ثم نلجأ بعد ذلك إلى ما يعرف بتمكين الاستقرار. العراق في تمكين الاستقرار لم يكن مستعد بأي برنامج من البرامج التي يمكن تنفيذها. في مراحل تمكين الاستقرار صدم العراق بثلاثة مشاكل عرقلت هذه البرامج التي هي في الغالب مستوردة، سواء كانت من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية أو من حلفاء الأوروبيين، كان هم الذين يقدمون استشارات لمكتب رئيس الوزراء، وبالتالي هو ينتقي من تلك البرامج ما يجده مناسبا لبيئة نينوى، الأنبار، صلاح الدين، كركوك، حزام بغداد، ديالى، المناطق التي تعاني من الإرهاب. الصدمة الأولى أن المناطق التي تم تحريرها أصبح لديها شعور أن هناك غزو بديل يأتي إلى مدنها بدلا من داعش، وهو ما يعرف بغنائم المنتصرين الأكراد والشيعة. القوات الكردية والشيعية بمعاونة التحالف الدولي هي التي كان لها الدور الأكبر في طرد تنظيم داعش من العراق بمعية التحالف الدولي، مع خلاف بسيط بين الحشد الشعبي والتحالف الدولي. بالتالي حينما دخلت هذه القوات المحررة مثل أي منتصر يريد أن يتقاسم سلطات وثروات هذه المناطق، وظهرت مشاكل كبيرة، ولا تزال هذه المشاكل لا يستطيع رئيس الوزراء أن يحل هذه المشاكل. شعور راسخ الآن لدى العرب السنة والأقليات من الأيزيدية والشبك والتركمان والمسيحيين في تلك المناطق أن من حررهم يتقاسم سلطات تلك المناطق وثرواتها. هذا الشعور عرقل بشكل كبير الأموال الكبيرة التي أنفقها الاتحاد الأوروبي والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية والأصدقاء أن تنجز مشروع له قيمة. فمثلا المشاريع التي قامت بها معاهد محترمة مثل الجي اي زد، اليو اس اي بي، اليو اس ايد، كل هذه المشاريع لم تأتي بنتائج ملحوظة أو ملموسة، لا لأنهم فيهم نوع من الفساد، ولكن البيئة كانت غير قابلة أن تنفذ بها هذه البرامج، على اعتبار أن القوات المسيطرة تعرقل تنفيذ هذه البرامج. لم تكن برامج تمكين الاستقرار مستعدة لمثل هذا النوع من الصدمة، أن المنتصر يريد نسبة من الأموال حتى يسمح بتنفيذ أي مشروع حتى على مستوى مشاريع حوارية. فمثلا في معهد السلام الأمريكي نفذت 23 برنامج حواري مهم بين العشائر، وهو مشاريع مهمة لتعريف العرب السنة بالأقليات الأخرى وصناعة ما يعرف بالتعاذر أو التسامح أو المصالحة الوطنية، ووقعت على ذلك وثائق. لكن حينما جاء التنفيذ كل هذه الوثائق لم تكن نافعة، وسوف أتكلم عن هذا الموضوع بالأرقام. لدينا الآن في العراق الآن في هذه الساعة 116 مخيم للنازحين. في هذه المخيمات 173 ألف عائلة، 173 ألف عائلة، منهم 93 ألف عائلة هم من عوائل داعش، هم من العوائل والأسر التي خرج منها أو من بينهم أبناء من داعش. هؤلاء عديدهم ليس بالقليل، 93 ألف عائلة بمعنى قرابة 370 ألف نسمة. 78% من هؤلاء هم أطفال ونساء، أطفال من أعمار 6 شهور صعودا إلى 16 سنة. هؤلاء الأطفال منذ 4 سنوات هم بدون مدارس. النساء بحسب رصدي وزيارتي لكثير من هذه المخيمات، النساء بعضهم 2 أو 3 صار عندهم إسقاط بسبب عمليات الاغتصاب مقابل بعض المساعدات يقدمها حارس السجن. أيضا كثير من النساء كنا يعملن في الحسبة، وهن الآن أشبه ما يكون بمدرسة متنقلة لتقديم المعلومات، فضلا على رداءة تلك المنطقة. بالإضافة إلى أن كثير من الأطفال رصدناهم يتم إخراجهم من قبل الحراس الفاسدين منذ الصباح الباكر حتى المساء في مناطق الطرق السريعة وتقاطع الطرق من أجل الشحوذية، اللي يخرج الطفل حتى يحصل على أموال ليعطيها للضابط في نهاية المساء. بالتالي هذه المشاكل الكثيرة ولدت هذه في المخيمات ما يعرف بأكاديميات لصناعة وتكريس الكراهية. لا توجد دراسات واضحة في كيفية التعامل مع هؤلاء النازحين. قدمت 3 اقتراحات لرئاسة الوزراء العراقية. أحد هذه الاقتراحات كان من الأوروبيين، وهو إعادة دمج هؤلاء في المجتمعات المحلية. مرة أخرى ترجع النساء والأطفال إلى تلك المدن التي كانوا فيها. فكانت المحاولة في 4 مناطق: منطقة سنجار، أقصد أطراف سنجار السنية، ومنطقة تل عفر للتركمان السنة، ومنطقة هيت للعرب السنة، ومنطقة الحامضية في الرمادي أيضا للعرب السنة. هذه النماذج فشلت فشل ذريع بعد مصالحات استمرت أكثر من سنة، وأنفق عليه الكثير من الأموال، حوارات بين شيوخ العشائر والمنظمات الدولية. فمثلا في هيت رجعت 507 عائلة. هيت منطقة تقع شمال غرب الرمادي مركز الأنبار. 507 عائلة هم نساء وأطفال وكبار السن. بعد أسبوع بدأت العشائر تنتقم وقتلوا أكثر من عائلة، وأيضا بدأوا يخرجون الرجال وينفذون عليهم عمليات الإعدام أمام القوات الأمنية وأمام العشائر، ويقول هذا ثأر نحن لا نتدخل به، هذا ثأر لا يمكن فبالتالي فعلا هناك سوء دمج بين آليات الوقاية وآليات مكافحة الإرهاب. حينما بدأت عمليات طرد الإرهاب من الأراضي العراقية لم يوضع هناك بالحسبان أن هناك صدمات. اليوم هذه مخيمات العزلة هي تعتبر خطر كبير، وأنا أتكلم فقط عن الذين هم ذهبوا إلى المخيمات لأنهم لا يمتلكون مال من عوائل داعش. وإلا في العراق نعتقد أن عوائل داعش عديدهم يزيد عن 700 ألف نسمة. 700 ألف نسمة الآن هم في هذه المخيمات العزلة، قريب 370 ألف نسمة ولا حلول. بالتالي ما يطرحه الأوروبيين من الدمج هم يتعاملون مع فرضيات، وكأنما هذه العوائل والسكان المحليين الذين تضرروا من داعش أشبه ما يكون بعناصر كيميائية يمكن دمجهم بمجرد تقريبهم بعضهم من بعض، وهذا ليس صحيح. التجاور لم يكن يوما من الأيام حلا. التجاور أن نأتي بهذه العائلة جيران لهذه العائلة لم يكن حلا في العراق. فمثلا الأيزيدية جاورهم العرب السنة من عشائر الخاتوني والجحيش وعشائر زويد وشمر لأكثر من 400 سنة، هم جيران 400 سنة، لكن مجرد أن جاء الحافز الفكري المتطرف سرعان ما انتمت الكثير من شباب تلك القرى إلى تنظيم داعش، وقاموا بذبح الأيزيدية وطردهم والاستيلاء على أموالهم. فالتجابر ليس حلا. معظم المشاريع والمقترحات التي طرحتها المنظمات الأوروبية تركز على موضوع التجاور، نخرج هذا من السجن ونتركه في الحي، ونطلب من الحي الذي ابن هذه العائلة كان سببا في مقتل أولادهم وفي تفجير بيوتهم وفي أذيتهم، نطلب من عنده أنه كن معه طيبا اقبله. هذه مشكلة. أيضا في زيارة لي متأخرة وأنا أدرس قرى الحدود السنية في المنطقة الغربية من العراق، زرت كثير من المساجد، وكنت أتعمد أن تكون زيارتي يوم الجمعة. لا يزال خطاب المسجد هو خطابا راديكاليا يصنع الكراهية، وينتقد الحكومة بنفس الأساليب التي كانت تنتقد بها حكومة المالكي في عام 2010 إلى عام 2013. بالتالي الأسباب التي صنعت من صعود تنظيم داعش في عام 2013 و2014 لا تزال موجودة في تلك القرى. تلك القرى ليست قليلة في مناطق جنوب نينوى، غرب صلاح الدين، شمال الأنبار. بحسب الإحصائيات الإدارية العراقية 314 قرية. هذه القرى لا تزال تؤمن واقعا بالخلافة، ولا تزال تؤمن بأفكار الوهابية، ولا تزال تؤمن إيمانا واضحا في كراهية الآخر، وأنها تعرف الآخر أنه العدو. هذه القرى كما ذكر أحد المداخلين صباحا تعيش عزلة. هذه العزلة بحد ذاتها تصنع منهم جيلا قابل أن يقبل التطرف ويعمل في خدمة التطرف العنيف. بالتالي لا يمكن أن نصنع هذا الجوار، لأن الجوار وحده لا يكفي. وأيضا اقتراح قدم لرئاسة الوزراء العراقية قبل شهر، وهذا الاقتراح ربما لن ينال قبول الأوروبيين، وهو أن نصنع لهم عزلة في الصحراء لوحدهم ونوفر لهم ما هو لائق من حقوق الإنسان. تقريبا هذا الموضوع لن يمول، والعراق لا يمتلك المال لتمويل هذا الشيء. هو ربما يطلب من الأوروبيين أن يمولوا مثل هكذا مشروع. والمنطقتين المقترحتين هنا منطقتين سيئة من حيث الجغرافيا والتضاريس. منصورية الجبل، وهو أحد السجون القمعية في فترة النظام السابق بالقرب من الحدود الإيرانية، وأيضا صحراء السماوة، وهي مقابر معارضين النظام السابق في ذلك الوقت. حصر قرابة 700 ألف إنسان في تلك المنطقة أولا يحتاج إلى اقتصاد كبير، وفي نفس الوقت لم تكن غوانتنامو يوما تجربة ناجحة أو قصة نجاح حتى نكررها في العراق مع هذا العدد الكبير من النساء والأطفال. بالتالي ما نحتاجه لرفع التطرف في بيئة 314 قرية، وهذه البيئة قال عنها أبو محمد العدناني في حزيران عام 2016: منها بدأنا وإذا هزمنا منها وإذا هزمنا نعود إليها ثم ننطلق من جديد. وهذا فعلا ما يحدث الآن في المنطقة الغربية من العراق التي بدأ منها البغدادي والعدناني. اليوم نشاط صعود واضح. في نوفمبر 2017 كان عديد تنظيم داعش بحسب الإحصائيات التحالف الدولي وبعد هزيمته بشكل واضح أقل من 1000 عنصر قتالي يتواجد في عموم العراق. اليوم في أقل تحديد هو لديه 10 قواطع. القاطع في تنظيم داعش يستحق هذا اللقب أو هذا الاسم قاطع، معناها فيه 300 إلى 350 مقاتل ناشط في معية كل 300 مقاتل ناشط بالقليل 500 مقاتل لوجستي. فبالتالي تقرير الأمم المتحدة كان واضح أنه في العراق سريعا بدأ يعود تنظيم داعش، وربما عديده ليس أقل بين العراق وسوريا من 18,000 مقاتل ناشط ولوجستي. وهذا التقرير مطابق للواقع تماما، لا نختلف معه كمحللين ومتابعين وأيضا كبيانات ومعلومات عراقية، فضلا على أن هذا التنظيم يجيد شيء ممكن أنتم انتبهي له بشكل واضح: يجيد التكيف مع أساليب الوقاية. ما من أسلوب من أساليب الوقاية يقترح أو يبدأ كمشروع إلا وهذا التنظيم يجيد التكيف معه. هو يجيد أيضا التكيف مع الهزيمة، وهو يختلف عن القاعدة، حينما يهزم يعترف بالهزيمة ويتكيف مع الهزيمة ويعود من جديد لينمو. وهذا ما يحدث في العراق. كثير من الناس الذين هم يكرهون تنظيم داعش ما حملهم اليوم إلى السكوت وعدم معاونة الأجهزة الأمنية العراقية من جديد إلا لأسباب أن هذه الأجهزة الأمنية جاءت لتقاسم ثروات مدنهم وأيضا للتسلط عليهم. في المنطقة الغربية السنية، هذه المنطقة اليوم تعاني من مشكلة كبيرة وهو التشيع السياسي. أصبحت القيادات التي تدير المحافظات السنية هي قيادات بوصايا وأيضا بإدارة أحزاب شيعية. هذا بحد ذاته يؤسس من جديد إلى عودة هذا التنظيم المتطرف. فهو بدأ في نهاية عام 2013 في العراق، بداية أنه جاء لحماية الهوية السنية، انتشار التشيع السياسي وليس التشيع الفقهي المذهبي الشكلي. انتشاره في المناطق الغربية السنية هو خطر أيضا، ولم تستعد له القوات التي هزمت الموارد البشرية لداعش، لم تستعد لمثل هذا الأسلوب. بالتالي التنظيم فيه صفتين تختلف عن القاعدة: صفة التكيف مع الهزيمة وأيضا التكيف مع أي أسلوب من أساليب الوقاية. شكرا.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور هشام على هذا التحليل الملم والشامل وعلى هذه الصورة التي نقلتها لنا عن الواقع في العراق، وهي يعني صورة للأسف تدعو إلى التشاؤم ما لم تتدخل الحكومة العراقية بسرعة وبطريقة خلاقة لإعادة دمج كل هذه الفئات المهمشة. دونت للحقيقة 3 نقاط جد مهمة في حديثك. أولا، أن الأسباب والعوامل التي تسببت بصعود داعش لا زالت موجودة في العراق، وهذه معضلة. الفكرة الثانية هي أهمية وخطورة الخطاب الديني اليوم، وكيف أن المساجد ورجال الدين قد يدفعون بعض العراقيين اليوم إلى العنف وإلى الإرهاب، وأهمية من هنا الإصلاح في الخطاب الديني. والفكرة الثالثة طبعا هي الفكرة الأخيرة التي أشرت إليها، وهي خطورة التشيع السياسي اليوم مقابل التشيع أو مقابل السنة السياسية السياسية ومقابل داعش. شكرا لك. So I will turn to the third and last speaker Peter Romaniuk. Peter Romaniuk, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York, where he's Associate Director of the Center on Terrorism. He also acts as Assistant Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies at the Graduate Center and as Senior Fellow at the Global Center on Cooperative Security. He is the author of an acclaimed book titled Multilateral Counterterrorism, The Global Politics of Cooperation and Contestation, which was published in 2010 by Routledge. And he recently wrote an article titled Counterterrorism, Cooperation and Global Governance, which appeared in International Organization and Global Governance. And today he will speak of the lessons learned and the recommendations for the MENA region. So said differently, he will give us an insight into the secret, magical solution and formula for terrorism.
Thank you very much, Jana, and thank you, of course, to the organizers for inviting me to present. I was given three guiding questions. The first refers to lessons learned and policy recommendations for the European Union, US, and Russia, as well as the United Nations, regarding counterterrorism measures in the MENA region, and how to improve the effectiveness of those measures to contribute towards stabilization in Syria and Iraq. The second guiding question was how to improve coordination and cooperation among governments in countering terrorism and radicalization despite their diverging interests. And the third question addressed future options for preventing radicalization in Syria and Iraq. These obviously are challenging questions, and I thought that it was interesting and important that the questions drew attention to the political context of responses to terrorism and extremism in Syria and Iraq. To be sure, measures aimed at preventing and countering violent extremism occur within a political context. But with that said, as I'll explain in a moment, the political context can sometimes enable responses at some level, even if more often they constrain responses. In addressing these questions, I wanted to preface my remarks by saying that I'm not a Middle East expert, and unlike my colleagues, in my presentation, I'm not drawing upon any original primary research that I've done in Syria and Iraq. Rather, my thematic specialization is in the field that's now known as PCVE, as my colleagues have mentioned and others have today. Of course, PCVE measures involve a broad range of non-traditional counterterrorism tools. In his presentation today, this morning, Matthew referred to sort of soft power approaches to counterterrorism. I think this is what he had in mind. Those non-traditional counterterrorism tools include social and development policies, counter-messaging campaigns, individual-level interventions, and programs that aim to build resilience to violent extremism among women, youth, and other vulnerable populations, however they are defined. What makes PCVE different from counterterrorism is that it applies these non-traditional counterterrorism tools in a preventive capacity, with the goal of preventing violence before it emerges. With the increase and evolution of extremist threats in recent times, PCVE has now become quite widespread, even if the term itself and the intensity of focus on PCVE is of a relatively recent origin. It is, as Jan said a moment ago, a crowded field these days. Now, the good news is that with all of this sort of recent experience in PCVE, there are actually plenty of lessons to be learned from the role of governments, international organizations, and civil society actors with their experience in PCVE to date. Now, back in 2015, I wrote a report for the Global Center on Cooperative Security, modestly titled, Does CVE Work?, where I reviewed what the publicly available evaluation research, so people that had actually sat down and asked the question, were CVE programs that had been ventured to that point effective or not? At that time, there were, as I discerned, some fairly clear lessons to be learned. For example, governments should be systematic, right? Governments should approach CVE to coin a phrase from the terrorism studies literature, not as firefighters, but as students of combustion. Right? This means, defining terms properly. What is extremism? What does it mean to be resilient? Right? Clarifying the scope of interventions. I think, Jan, a moment ago, you referred to diffuse versus an eliminating approach, right? Who exactly is the target audience here? Is this a macro, a meso, or a micro level intervention, and so on? I found at that time that governments had invested too heavily in developing and implementing CVE policy and had not thought about CVE in terms of a regular sort of policy cycle. That is to say, to undertake an assessment prior to developing and implementing policy, and then to endeavour to undertake an evaluation after having implemented policy, right? It was important to see CVE as a policy process. One of the big takeaway points from this research was that CVE can have unintended consequences, especially minority Muslim communities in the West experience CVE as just another form of counterterrorism. There were real concerns about the implementation of CVE and its capacity to do damage to human rights and civil liberties, and so on. Also, as mentioned by Jan, he talked about a magical solution. Looking back now, I think a lot of governments in this sort of first wave of CVE programming had wildly optimistic expectations as to what it could actually achieve. And it's important, I think, to take from that we need to be modest in setting our objectives and to work towards well-defined goals. A final point there was to engage broadly and partner strategically. I think governments learned very quickly that there are these people out there that we started calling sort of trusted interlocutors, and they started getting a lot of calls and emails and being pressed into this work. But I think that happened without a sort of period of awareness raising or without a period in which governments tried to sort of develop a shared perception of what the problem actually is. Modestly, I would say that subsequent research has yielded findings that are broadly similar to those that I derived in 2015. And I'd draw attention to sort of 3 points of relative consensus. I think the research since has shown the importance of undertaking assessments of violent extremism problems prior to the policy development phase. In fact, if you sort of sit down and think about explanations of terrorism and violent extremism, one takeaway point is that violent extremism problems are highly context specific, right? There are certain generic attributes that we can observe across cases, but violent extremism in different parts of the world has different kinds of characteristics. A second point that's a point of consensus in the current literature is that CVE programs should be focusing on behavioral aspects of extremism as opposed to ideational aspects. That is to say, governments have found it very difficult to stop the spread of bad ideas. And measures that have been cast very broadly and addressed towards bad ideas have been less successful, I think, than those that are targeted towards those who might be vulnerable to taking bad ideas and acting upon them in a violent fashion. A third point, which actually came up this morning in Bibi's presentation as well, is to underscore the importance of evaluation. Evaluations of CVE programs have improved, but they remain too infrequent. And what this means is that the evidentiary baseline for PCVE interventions remains very modest indeed. My own more recent research on CVE has underscored these and related points. I said I haven't done field work in Syria and Iraq, but I did have the chance a couple of years ago to do some field work in East Africa. And for example, the cases of Tanzania and Uganda, we actually ended up, it was a project for UK DFID, and we ended up coming back and saying, we're not sure that these environments are ripe for CVE. At least in Uganda, for example, you have the Museveni regime is very effective at co-opting counterterrorism assistance and would easily co-opt CVE as well. In Tanzania, you have this sort of complex evolution of intercommunal conflict alongside a formative al-Shabaab presence. It's easy to sort of confuse those two with the unintended consequence that Muslims who are expressing their faith in a different way become inadvertently labeled as vulnerable to al-Shabaab recruitment. So in both of those cases, we highlighted the risks of unintended consequences. So if there are lots of lessons to be learned, thinking about how to apply them presents significant challenges. And in thinking about my presentation today, it seemed to me that Syria and Iraq at present are in many ways obviously hard cases for PCVE. And there's a question of whether and how these lessons apply at all. Beyond comprising sort of interesting background information, how can the lessons of the global PCVE experience contribute to our responses in Syria and Iraq? And I did come up with a couple of sort of points to contribute here. Firstly, and I think this has been made clear by the discussion so far today, I think we can improve our understanding of extremism in these two countries. It's always a self-serving thing for somebody who makes a living in research to say, but the first thing the governments should do is send in the researchers. We know the importance of assessment. We know the importance of context specificity of violent extremism problems. We mouth the platitude of evidence-based policy. We know that achieving evidence-based policy, especially in these difficult environments, is very hard indeed. But if we're not basing policy on evidence, then on what are we basing policy? Magical solutions or fairy dust, right? Now, obviously, I defer to my colleagues who have more experience on the ground, but just in sort of doing a quick review of the published sort of academic literature, there were a couple of examples that came up to demonstrate that this research is difficult, but that it can be done. My former colleague at John Jay College, Scott Atran, and his colleagues for many years have been undertaking research in Iraq, most often with captured ISIS fighters held by the YPG, but more recently, for example, with young men in Mosul after the retreat of the Islamic State. And they were able to demonstrate, disaggregate, what young men in Mosul, who are obviously highly vulnerable to sort of the re-emergence of ISIS, they were able to disaggregate what they, as a group, found appealing about ISIS and what they didn't find appealing about ISIS. This is sort of the kind of evidence that can really plug into CVE programming in a useful way that I think can overcome the simplistic approaches that Hisham described a moment ago. A second point here regards mapping the relevant existing interventions. Now, generally we use different terms: stabilization, social cohesion, resilience, peace enforcement or peace building. We use these different terms to describe measures in a conflict or post-conflict setting that we might describe as PCVE in a different kind of context. There's nothing magic about the label of PCVE. And in fact, sometimes it can be, entail certain risks. In preparing for today, I was able to do sort of a quick review of the strategic plans among development actors, especially those in Iraq, and the way in which they utilize the rhetoric of CVE. And to be sure, the UNDP and even the World Bank use the language of resilience and social cohesion, reconciliation, peaceful coexistence, and so on. And I do think it would be useful to sort of map these interventions in real time to keep a track of who is doing what, and obviously to the extent that that programming can be evaluated would be a really useful sort of input. A final point here is to encourage stakeholders to think about violent extremism in a way that is integrated strategically with other important goals, especially regarding development and the development of and the building of institutions in the justice sector. In his presentation again this morning, Matthew referred to the UN's global counterterrorism strategy. Another footnote here would be to the Secretary General's PVE plan of action. And I understand from my discussion in a coffee break earlier today that the government of Iraq is developing its own national action plan in response to this, the UNSG's plan of action. That document, the PVE plan of action, has its flaws, but it at least draws attention to the ways in which violent extremism problems are connected to other problems. And so if we are to successfully articulate CVE with counterterrorism, let alone with all of the other important things that need to be done, we need to get that right at the strategic level. That point, of course, extends to, in listing these points, I don't want to strike too much of an optimistic tone. I don't think there's too much risk of optimism on this topic at all. But I do want to note that, you know, for better or worse, as I say there, strategic level disagreement among major players, among the main stakeholders, can actually have the effect of creating a permissive environment for PCVE work to go ahead. Stephen made a similar point in his presentation this morning, where he talked about cooperation among intelligence agencies. I would make a slightly different point to say that, you know, high-level disagreements need not preclude lower stakes interventions. I wasn't surprised to hear Hannah talking about how, you know, the Russians aren't about to move into the PCVE space, but they don't really have a strong incentive to stop others from doing so, right? And again, sorry, that point can be extended to more conventional counterterrorism capacity building assistance. This is what Stephen described earlier as sort of the technocratic approach, and I'm aware that organizations like the Global Center, with which I'm affiliated, have done some programming, for example, with Iraq's Financial Intelligence Unit to build anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing capacity in that country. So then, to conclude, what are the prospects for overcoming these diverging interests? I think every speaker today has given a fairly bleak response to that and related questions. And I'd simply sort of add my voice to the chorus that at the best sort of deconfliction, as it were, is perhaps the best we could hope for. The question of sort of how to proceed, it strikes me, attracts a lot of dissonance both within governments and across governments. I think that point has been made on a number of occasions today. But one takeaway from today for me is that Iraq in particular seems to me to be at a bit of a fulcrum point. Whether we frame measures in terms of stabilization or PCVE, it seems to me that the future of Iraq will be impacted by our ability to transition from hard to soft responses to terrorism and violent extremism. So in addition to being a hard case, it seems to me that Iraq is also kind of a critical case. And for that reason, I think that civil society organizations like Konrad Adenauer and its partners are right to be interested in advancing the best measures possible given the constraints of the environment.
Thank you very much, Peter. Your analysis seems to be grounded to a certain extent in Middle Eastern exceptionalism, in the sense that you pointed out to the fact that one needs to take into consideration the specific features of Middle Eastern countries when formulating a counterterrorism and PVE program. You pointed out to something that is very important and very interesting. You said that it's necessary to map the interventions of international organizations in the Middle East in the area of PCVE. But maybe it's also important to undertake for the first time proper monitoring and proper evaluation of these interventions, because UNESCO, UNDP, USAID have been implementing PCVE programs since the early 2000s, and yet this did not prevent the rise of Daesh, of Al-Nusra, and of other groups that we consider today as terrorists. So I will open the floor immediately to the Q&A, but maybe I will seize this opportunity and make an abuse of power and ask myself the first question, if you would allow. When we talk about terrorism, I mean, it's impossible to formulate an effective and an efficient response to terrorism unless states first understand exactly who the terrorist threat is and who the enemy is. Regarding Daesh today, there is a big controversy, a big debate in Europe over how to interpret the phenomenon of Daesh. You have on the one end of the spectrum some scholars like Gilles Kepel, for example, in France, who argues that Daesh reflects the radicalization of Islam. Basically, for him, the most important motivations driving Daesh jihadists are religious factors, ideological factors. And for him, at the heart of Islam, there are some elements that push toward violence. So for him, in order to formulate a proper response to Daesh, one needs to take into consideration identity politics. On the other end of the spectrum, we have scholars like Olivier Roy and others who highlight that Daesh is not a phenomenon of radicalization of Islam, but rather it is a phenomenon of Islamicization of radicalism, l'islamisation de la radicalité. So basically he underplays or he downplays the religious motivations, and he argues that Daesh is like any other extremist group, and Daesh only makes an instrumental use of Islam and of religious language, and that after all, what is driving Daesh jihadists are socioeconomic factors and institutional failure in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. So my question is, where would you, so it's addressed to the three of you, where would you place yourself in this debate? And if we consider that Daesh is a problem of identity politics, then who are the stakeholders and who are the actors in the Arab world who are well placed and who are legitimately placed to undertake a first reform of the Islamic doctrine and the Islamic language and to rethink religion? And if we consider that Daesh is driven by socioeconomic factors and by institutional failure, then basically we're saying that the US and the EU and others cannot hope to defeat Daesh without engaging in nation building and state building efforts in the Middle East. But then, if they want to engage in state building and nation building, how can they do that without being accused and labeled as neo-colonial states?
I'm being very colonial.
Exactly.
أنا أعرف داعش والقاعدة أنهم حركات إحيائية إسلامية طهورية، وهم يشبهون إلى حد كبير حركة محمد عبد الوهاب مؤسس الوهابية، ويشبهون إلى حد كبير حركة خميني، وإن كان الخلاف في المذهب والتفاصيل، فهم حركات معولمة إحيائية تريد إحياء الحكم بما أنزل الله بطهورية. أقصد بطهورية إنه إما معي أو أنت مقتول. نعم تمام. هذه
I think the real answer, and I have a different view of Gilles Kepel and Olivier Roy, is I think it's all about credibility. And what I mean by that is I think international supporters of Daesh and Al-Qaeda have a very, very different view of those that are from the region. But what I mean with the credibility is talking about common denominators. They all want to change something. They all want to take part in that project. And if they believe that the person with the most credibility is Daesh or Al-Qaeda, and if they believe it's somebody preaching far-right ideology or left-wing, and it allows them to act on their perceived lack of or their grievance, saying these people are incompetent, I can do better, or they're wrong, I can do better, I think this is where the vessel becomes very different. So the basic understanding, the frustration to want to do something, saying I don't believe in any of these people until an alternative figure comes in, I think is really what affects how the effect an organization can have. And I think that's, in my opinion, that's what we should focus on. But I think I'm just one person, so.
This is the second time today that these two authors have come up in contrast to each other. haven't read either of the two books, but I would say that why does it have to be one over the other, right? Right. I mean, these are two competing hypotheses. There are others out there. You know, the point of undertaking assessments of violent extremism problems is to figure out which is which in which part of the world. I do think, a couple of additional points. I don't think that Islam obviously has a monopoly on extremism. That makes me sound like a typical Western liberal. But it's also the case that, you know, both in the developed world and in the developing world, there is kind of a natural evolution of the way in which people practice their faith. I think in both rich countries and poor countries, there have been rising levels of fundamentalism in various guises over the years. I mean, I can tell you that more Australians attend religious services than they did when I was a kid. I mean, it's really shocking to me, having been raised in a sort of thoroughly secular environment. And in my research in the developing world, I think Western researchers frequently misunderstand the sort of natural level of variation in terms of religious practices. They misunderstand that with extremism. You know, the fact that some Muslims adopt some habits, wearing their trousers shorter, growing a beard or whatever, as a sign of extremism seems to me to neglect the fact that Christians preaching on the street corner are undergoing a similar kind of social process. I also would add that, you know, if we agree to the distinction between behavioral radicalization, right, acting violently, and ideational or cognitive radicalization, possessing bad ideas, sometimes we think that you can't have behavioral radicalization without first being cognitively radical, right? And I just don't think that's correct, right? I think you can be a behavioral radical and not really believe in what you're doing, right? This is the accidental guerrilla phenomenon, to go back to David Kilcullen's book, right? Where he talks about life in an Afghan valley and how, you know, people join the Taliban because the Taliban apparently can provide the one most valuable public good, which is security. They're not necessarily true believers in the Taliban, but they go along to get along, to use that expression. And so we should, you know, we have those two hypotheses from Roy and Capel, but there are other hypotheses out there, which is that, you know, if I was living in an Afghan valley or living in some part of Iraq that's been affected by conflict for my entire lifetime or thereabouts, I'm not sure how I'd respond, right? And we should leave open the idea that you can go along to get along.
Yeah, my name is Rendra Rahim. I'm president of the Iraq Foundation. First of all, I want to agree totally with Peter, and I think we need to distinguish between the prophets and the evangelists on the one hand, and the recruits on the other. And the drivers and motivations may be different for these two sets of people. We have conducted rather superficial questionnaires, I don't want to boast too much, among communities in recently liberated areas, Mosul, Ramadi, and so on, about what they think the drivers of radicalization and violent extremism are. And I have to say, I mean, there was a whole range. Now, the top one that was cited was the religious rhetoric. But very close next to that was the economy, close to that was the feeling of oppression and so on. Now, these were sort of, I call them potential recruits. These were not members of ISIS at any time, but these were in the communities in which radicalization could arise. And so I think this either or, it's good for an academic argument between Capel and Roy, but in reality, I don't think we should accept that. And again, as I say, we should distinguish between the prophets and evangelists and those who are recruited for other reasons. Actually, I want to ask Hisham about the national strategy, الخطة الاستراتيجية لمكافحة التطرف والعنف, the national strategy to counter violent extremism that the Iraqi government and the National Security Council of Iraq has developed and should by now actually have completed and should be acting on. Could you tell us a little bit about this? And can I make just one more statement? Again, back to Peter. You say Iraq is a focal point and a sort of a laboratory, if you want, really, isn't it? The problem is I don't think anybody's paying attention. This is this is the big challenge we have. Nobody's paying attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers. I think this question is mainly to Dr. Hisham. One of the issues often overlooked is that terrorist organization, army sometimes, but definitely ISIS as well, has used sexual violence as a means of terrorizing the population. Now, the victims of this conflict-related sexual violence are living amongst the communities, are maybe excluded from the communities, and it is certainly not addressed when, if at all, people are brought before trial to face justice for the crimes that they have been committed. These issues that men and women and young children have actually suffered are completely not addressed. Now, this leaves big wounds and traumas, not only with the people involved, but also potentially with the next generation of children coming out of the sexual violence and whole communities. Can you reflect on how that is addressed or perceived or affecting the communities that you've been working with?
Thank you. I want to comment on the issue of the role of religious ideology behind radicalization or behind ISIS's thinking. And just a quick comment, like the religious understanding or the religious discourse, Islamic discourse, has always been shaped since the inception of Islam by the politics or by this is since the Abbasids, since the Umayyads, and even not to go that far, during the Afghan war, for Morocco, for instance, opened the door for jihad. They were giving visas to everyone to go and fight in Pakistan. But then once terrorism hit Morocco, all this ended, and the religious discourse, instead of being, studying from Saudi Wahhabi books, now they're all Sufi, and they're all, so this has always, this religious understanding and discourse has always been shaped by politics. And today, Muslims are mostly they understand the religion according to what they received from Saudis after the Iranian Revolution. This is one thing, and this brings me to Iraq. I was on a field trip to Iraq not a long time ago, and we were talking to major religious institutions in Iraq, and they don't believe that there's a problem with the discourse or with the understanding of Islam. They believe that ISIS came as a package and left as a package, but we have a moderate discourse. Instead, their main concerns about ISIS is not really the ideology. Their main concern is socioeconomic reasons, Shia dominance, these kinds of issues. This doesn't really have to do with ideology. And so my question is, I don't know which one of you or maybe all of you, is these discussions we're going through, these very important discussions and conclusions and recommendations, how is the best way that they reach the decision makers, and how is the best way to come around when there's a clash between political interests and these facts on the ground? Thank you.
جوابي للدكتورة رند، نعم هناك استراتيجية وأقرت شهر 4 وأسست لجنة خاصة تسمى بلجنة التسامح والتعايش، تعتمد على 5 مراحل. قد تعمل هذه المراحل ال5 الآن بالتوازي. المرحلة الأولى تأسيس لجنة تسمى لجان الحكماء، وهذه اللجنة هي للمصالحات المناطقية والعشائرية في داخل كل منطقة. أيضا وزارة التربية والتعليم العالي والإعلام وبعض المنظمات المحلية تم الاتفاق معها لصناعة ما يعرف بالتعريف بالآخر، وحاول أن يجري المقاربات بين الثقافات المتعددة خاصة في نينوى وكركوك وديالى. هذا الشغل الآن قائم، لكن يبقى كيف يمكن أن ينجح هذا الشيء. أيضا الأوقاف الآن تجلس أسبوعيا في كل منطقة بلجان مشتركة، الأوقاف المسيحية ديانات والأوقاف الشيعية والسنية، أيضا لتوحيد الخطاب ومحاولة قراءة جديدة للنصوص المقدسة الإسلامية وإذاعتها على المنابر. وهذه حقيقة تلكأت كثيرا وبسبب المشاكل بين يعني مشاكل بين الأيزيديين وكيف يتم تعريف الأيزيديين إسلاميا. إلى هذه الساعة الشيعة والسنة متفقين على أنهم مجموعة وثنية كافرة، وهذا التعريف رئيس الوقف السني أو رئيس الوقف الشيعي لا يستطيع أن يأتي بتعريف جديد، ويخشى أن يأتي بتعريف جديد. تعلقت هذه الأمور كثيرا، وكنت حاضران بعض هذه الحوارات. أيضا تمكين المناطق من الديمقراطية، سواء كانت وسائل الديمقراطية أو حتى تعريفهم بالديمقراطية بما يليق. الناس اليوم لا إيمان لهم بالديمقراطية التي جاءت بها الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية بعد 2003، فهذه عودة سريعة، لكنها سوف تكون في هذه المناطق السنية، عودة لتعريف الناس من جديد بالديمقراطية وإرجاع الإيمان، لأنهم في انتخابات 2018 أكثر من 80% قاطعوا، وهم غير مؤمنين بالديمقراطية ولا بوسائل الديمقراطية، ليس لأنهم متطرفين بل لأنهم أصابتهم الكثير من النكسات وبسبب التزوير وبمشاكل أخرى. الخامسة هو إعادة الإعمار، وهذه الحد الآن هذه عقبة كبيرة، كون الجماعات المنتصرة الكردية والشيعية تسيطر على العقود والمشاريع وتمنع تنفيذ الإعمار في هذه المناطق. هذه الخطة الخماسية التي تعتمدها اللجنة الجديدة اللي هي لجنة عليا في مكتب رئيس الوزراء، وتبقى هي إلى الآن لم تعمل بشكل كثيف نحو تمكين الاستقرار، لكنها تسعى إلى تمكين الاستقرار. بالنسبة للمتضررات والمتضررين من النساء والأطفال من داعش، حقيقة هناك منحة هولندية الآن تعمل عليها بعض كليات علم الاجتماع وعلم النفس والكليات المختصة بطرائق التدريس، ربما تبدأ بنوع من إنشاء مستشفيات مستوصفات، لكن يبقى أنه لا توجد لدينا بيانات حقيقية عن هذا الموضوع، لأنه في العادات والتقاليد سواء كانت للأقليات الدينية الأيزيدية المسيحيين التركمان الشيعة الشبك الكاكائية، هؤلاء يرون أن البنت حتى لو اغتصبت ينبغي أن تقتل، وبالتالي لا أحد يصرح في مثل هذه المعلومات. فمثلا 5000 أيزيدية تم خطفهم وتغييبهم لفترات مختلفة، اللي اعترفوا هم أقل من 70. أما التركمان الشيعة خطف منهم أكثر من 600، على اعتبار أن في عقيدة داعش يعتبرون التركمان الشيعة كفار أصليين، وبالتالي تقوم عليهم أحكام التي تقوم على الأيزيدية. في تقارير لما أردنا أن ندونها وتكون في تقارير للإعلام، كبار وشيوخ وأعيان ووجهات تركمان الشيعة بدأوا يهددون أنه أنتم مجرد ما تذكرون هذه المعلومات احنا نقاضيكم قضائيا وإن كانت صحيحة. أما المسيحيين فالمسيحيين أيضا في الغالب من تعرضنا لمثل هذا الموضوع في مناطق سهل نينوى، هذول أيضا عاداتهم عادات عشائرية، فالبنت تقع في مشاكل كبيرة إذا ما ذكرت أنها اغتصبت من قبل داعش. أما الككائية فهم عندهم قطعا الحكم بالقتل حتى لو اغتصبت، يعني بمجرد أنها تشير أنها اغتصبت تقتل يعني. فهذه بحد ذاتها مشكلة. من يمكن أن تزور مثل هذه المستوصفات أظن قليل جدا، بالتالي المفترض أن علماء النفس وعلماء الاجتماع وبعض المتابعين من وزارة الصحة هم راح يزورون فقط المستوصفات في دهوك ومخمور ومستوصف العفو ومخيم القيارة. هناك بعض النساء يعترفن بالسر لبعض هؤلاء الأطباء ويتم إشراكهم في بعض الجلسات دون أن يتم الإعلام عن نوع هذا البرنامج أو المشروع. شكرا.
Peter.
Just in response to our colleague from the Iraq Foundation, I meant to say, I may have said focal point. It should be a focal point. I meant to say fulcrum point, like a switching point, right? Right. Sorry, that's my non-verbal for fulcrum point, right? Rather than focal point. But with regard to your question of, who's paying attention, we frequently talk about evidence-based policy, and we pat ourselves on the back for being diligent in gathering lessons learned. But we also know that, at best, policy making is a sausage factory, and some administrations more than others are willing to conjure the facts and make decisions on the basis of whatever the hell they want to make decisions on the basis of. So who's paying attention? I share your exasperation. Right.
You asked at the end, how do you get the message to decision makers? Maybe I'm being really cynical, but I always count on personal interest. So I always try to present the ideas as if they have it and how it's extremely beneficial for them. So I don't care about the credit, but what we do in Nigeria or in Mali, for example, that works splendidly. They promote us if they're doing great things. Hey, what matters is the end result, but that's a very cynical view.
Thank you very much for your attention. And now I would like to invite Gregor Jake, the head of office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, to give some closing remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, but also on behalf of our partner organizations, Maison du Futur and the Wilfried Martin Center, I would like to thank you all of you, for your attendance. Special thanks to our experts, to our speakers for their valuable input. Special thanks also to our moderators. And last but not least, thanks to all of you for the rich and fruitful discussion. And I'm aware of the fact, or I do know, that this will be an ongoing discussion, and I can assure you that Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and their partner organizations will continue to contribute to this important debate. So in this sense, see you again soon. Goodbye. Thank you.
Ja, sehr gerne.